Thank you very much to Steve, Ari, and Bob. I think those are incredibly important insights as we think about what comes next in the next weeks and months. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel this afternoon and to invite my colleague Jennifer Ditchburn, Editor-in-Chief of Policy Options magazine, to help us lead through this discussion. And also Ailish Campbell, the Chief Trade Commissioner at Global Affairs Canada, and Madelaine Drohan, Canada correspondent for my second favorite magazine after PO, The Economist. Jennifer will start with Ailish and Madelaine, and as a second segment in this panel discussion, we'll invite Ari, Steve, and Bob to join the discussion. And certainly, we're really hoping to hear from you. And so there are microphones in the audience, and we hope that you'll have lots of comments and questions for the folks that we've gathered here today. Alors, Jennifer, à toi.
Merci, Graham. This is working great. Well, thank you. So Ailish and I are friends, but we never see each other very much anymore. So now is my chance to ask our Chief Trade Commissioner about your job. I finally get a chance to ask how it's going. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you're hearing on the ground that Canadian firms are facing, maybe touching a little bit also on the previous discussion in the presentation about the challenges specifically that SMEs face in trying to get into new markets or expand their activities already.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it will surprise anyone in this room that the major preoccupation, obviously, that we hear from firms across the country is, so what is going to happen with NAFTA? And of course, my key message is that we are preparing for many scenarios. And you know, we can't be in a better position as a country in terms of our knowledge of our counterparty. This is someone we've been living with since we were created. In fact, I'd like to say maybe even First Nations had it right. There was no border. There was true free trade, so maybe there's something to learn from them in that respect. But you know, history matters here. We know each other very well. We know the teams that we're going to be working with. Steve Verheuel, who has just negotiated the Canada-EU trade agreement, is coming off that agreement and has been appointed our chief negotiator. So I feel like Canada continues to have you know, the A-team ready. Lots of outreach, most importantly to the business community. I think, you know, my job as the Chief Trade Commissioner is to ensure that the ongoing and enduring relationship of trade and commerce just, you know, keeps on going. And in that respect, we have been doing an extensive amount of outreach. John's group has been very important in terms of providing their advice and intelligence to ministers in the government, the chambers of commerce, CFIB, and others. You've seen our aggressive and I think really purposeful and yet calm outreach to every Republican governor, members of Congress. So we're preparing really well. What I would say is that businesses are telling us they want, number one, they want this, you know, done and completed quickly. They don't want to be in a very, you know, in a long process. And we hear them. We're ready to keep that tempo really quickly because I think the challenge right now is uncertainty. And the second thing they tell us is, okay, we know we're going into this, so let's make it into an opportunity. NAFTA is, you know, it's an old agreement. We've negotiated TPP, in fact, with the U.S. So we've actually done it. We didn't complete the agreement. We've done a negotiation with the U.S. since NAFTA. So we have a really good sense of what's going to be in that agreement. And now I think that combined with the Canada-EU trade agreement provides us a really good template. On SMEs, I think, and I don't know if is Joy Knott here from Importers and Exporters? All this to say, it's really important for those of us who are practitioners to remember what it's like to be running a business, and those are very different, like the theory of trade versus the practice of trade. The theory of the border and border thickening versus the actual practice of getting a good or service or person across the border is very challenging, and SMEs have limited resources. So how do we make everything easier We're doing it a little at the border with e-manifest. Lots more work to do on making the border thinner. We're doing it in terms of our tools. Really pleased to have launched the tariff finder, which will allow people to immediately search for their goods and services online, thanks to our partners with BDC and EDC, making everything visible. Using our digital tools to inform people about CETA. As much as we're all going to love going to CETA speeches, it's like the most announced agreement of all. It's like a baby whose birth keeps being announced, and people are like, I just want to hold the baby. Well, we may get to hold the baby very soon, but people are going to go online. So getting our digital tools much more rational and sorted out for SMEs is really important. And I just have to underscore what Bob and other people were sharing about that inclusive, progressive piece of the trade agenda. That's live for us because EDC, I like to joke, it's measured on whether it's successful every year by if it creates a profit and a return to the fiscal framework. One of our challenges is to make sure that Canadians continue to support trade, and that's why Minister Champagne and this government have been very aggressively and very intentionally, promoting the progressive trade agenda, which is really about making sure that people feel that trade is about them, that they can access it. And they may not be a direct exporter, but they can export through a supply chain, and making that opportunity visible to them and their communities is something we'll continue to do.
Well, actually, on that point, Madelaine, I'll ask you, do you think that it's a myth that Canadians are maybe more amenable to trade at this point than, let's say, people in the United States or the UK?
No, I don't think it's a myth, although I'd have to say that it's not all Canadians. I mean, if we had a dairy farmer in the room right now, we'd hear a very different view than we've been hearing from everyone else. But I say the majority are supportive of trade, and there's a couple of reasons for that, and more so than what you see in the UK or in the US. I mean, one is just that trade has been an important thing for Canadian leaders, even before we had Canadian leaders. Ailish won't remember this, but you sent a tweet about Ben Franklin visiting Montreal,
yeah.
And I looked into it to
prepare
see,
for a possible acquisition.
Yeah, he was trying to actually persuade the residents of what was then Quebec to join the American Revolution, and they turned him down for two reasons. I mean, one was that they didn't trust all the promises about that Roman Catholicism would be protected there, but the second one was trade, because one of the conditions was that that Canada would have to stop trading with Britain. And even then we were quite calculating about, what side our bread was buttered on, and we thought, no, that's probably not a good idea. So it's been part of the Canadian narrative for a long time, and at least for the last 30 years, the political leaders have made a point of saying trade is good for you. There's this constant narrative. But the other huge difference between Canada and US and the UK on this one is that we don't have the same immigration debate going on. It doesn't have the same heat. And the speakers were mentioning before, trade has gotten wrapped up in the US and in the UK with the anti-immigration, anti-globalization sentiment, whereas here it still seems to be slightly distinct. So yes, the majority are still, trade is still popular here for the time being.
Ailish, you're traveling all the time. You have this connection to the World Economic Forum. What are you seeing as the perception of Canada's anti-protectionist message internationally? How's that going over?
Yeah, I've never seen such global interest in Canada and our way of doing business and our culture. It's it's really great to see. Now the question is, what can we translate that into something that's meaningful in terms of foreign policy and politics? And I think we can, and I think we are, in terms of an unprecedented amount of engagement with more diversified markets. Whether that's leading discussions on the future of TPP or whether that's engaging in ASEAN. I would note a very interesting paper released yesterday on Canada-Asia trade I'm wearing this jacket on purpose. I thought to myself, I might as well come and, sort of say that there's actually a province that's reached the holy grail of trade diversification that we've long talked about since, I think Joe Clark and others since the 70s have talked about, and that's BC. They've reached 50% total trade, merchandise trade and services with the United States, and about 50% with the rest of the world. And that is a really, and BC, by the way, is got the hottest growth rate, almost 3%, slightly above 3% of all the provinces. And I think there's something in that. I think that diversification message, that openness is there. Now, how does that translate for businesses? I think that's really the interesting question. For some companies, it will be the ability to attract talent that feels that they can be accepted and safe here and have a long-term future for their children here. For some businesses, I think that's still going to be based on market access, which again makes locking down what NAFTA, the next generation, really important. With NAFTA, CETA, we have access to 1.3 billion of the world's richest consumers. And even when we were in China, the Chinese ministers, are taking notes. That's a very significant number, as much as that's almost larger than the Chinese market, but of course, at a much higher purchasing power opportunity in terms of consumers. So I'm seeing it. What we hear a lot from businesses is there's a great brand, we're not applying it, and particularly we're not applying it to small and medium-sized enterprises. So I really hope one action that my team, who's responsible for implementing the investment hub, which was announced in the fall economic statement, one thing we're really hoping to do is use some of the funding that we got through that entity to create a far more purposeful brand for the purposes of foreign direct investment, but then use that as an economic brand, and also to, perhaps create a brand that can be used more intentionally by companies to tie some of this together and buy down for SMEs some of the expense of marketing yourself as a Canadian company.
Can you unpack that a little bit for me? How would that branding work? Like, maybe just give me an example of a company using the brand.
Well, right now, for example, and I should say, it's the old joke. Hi, I'm the government. I'm here to help you. So I don't want to say that we would apply the strategy. I think we need a lot of input from business to make this real. But we know we have a good brand and visual. We know what that is. It's the maple leaf. It's definitely the most visible sign. We hear from businesses across Canada. The brand isn't, my product, my city, my region. It really is Canada. And then how are we able to say, is that a made in Canada trademark? If you think of Switzerland or Ireland, even Hong Kong, they've been much more intentional just about a visual for their country. So is that literally a visual, and then we allow companies to either, access that freely, or there's some kind of accreditation? That's the kind of thing that I think we need to work through with other businesses, what that could mean for them. What I'm really interested in on the branding side of things is moving away from the moose, mounties, and mountains kind of vision of Canada.
Good luck.
Okay, so if you bring a Mountie to a trade show, bam, it's like, you'll get everyone coming over to say hi. So I agree with you, we're never gonna get away from it. But when we pitch Canada and we're showing people parks, my favorite reaction was this CEO in Silicon Valley, and he said, well, I know where I'll go hiking, but where would the people live? Would they live in tents? And he was kind of joking, but he wasn't. He was like, really? This is what you're offering. So branding our cities, Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, Calgary, Vancouver, and all of the really fantastic standards of living and access to our universities, access to also access to, to cultural activities. That's what we're hearing that's like 100,000 feet. And as people in this room know, beware the bean counters. Every good pitch eventually goes to a CFO, eventually goes to the deal team, and they're just knocking, 100 to 200 items off a list, and you will just be compared in black and white to other jurisdictions, which is why staying total tax competitive is essential at the end of the day. Our ability of individual companies to stay productive and competitive on those factors is still, you've got to have a high pitch, and then you've got to have the ability to go in and have an effective conversation with the CFO. We're watching, obviously, the U.S. actions on anything tax-related very carefully.
So as you alluded to before, the book has a lot of content on inclusive trade, making sure that more people benefit from that. But there's also the public engagement piece, and I wonder, maybe Madelaine, what you think. You mentioned before also that not everybody is is for more trade liberalization. So how do we properly engage the public in discussions around trade?
How good are we doing or not?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah.
In fact, every time you bring up public engagement, I think it often means talking to companies, talking to businesses, talking to business groups, like Mr. Manley's, which is a great group. But if you really want to ensure that that Canadians stay supportive of this, the message has to be much broader, and it has to be put in non-technical terms. It's not just about the opportunities for business, it also has to persuade people that they get benefits from trade as well. And I noticed that this came up, it was sort of mentioned in bits and pieces in the book. As far as I could tell, there was no distinct chapter on inclusiveness. I looked for one, thinking specifically about people and not just about companies. And I think it would be very interesting to see, I know in the conclusions you talk about how to deal with trade losers. That's a very good example of something that the government doesn't do a good job of communicating in the past. I covered the WTO negotiations, the Uruguay round from beginning to end. I covered the Canada-US trade. I covered then the NAFTA trade. And trade, the emphasis is always on the winners, but these days the losers are getting more vocal. And if there is no emphasis on what can we do for you, you're going to lose them. No, that's the big thing. There is a discussion in the book about certain programs that have been used to compensate trade losers, and they were dismissed as inefficient. But I think you shouldn't forget the symbolism of that. I'm not suggesting you put in inefficient programs, but you do need to show the public very visibly that they are not going to be left behind if they self-identify as a loser. And the losers always seem to know themselves. It's the winners that, you know, are more quieter because they don't often know who they're going to be.
Madelaine, there's a lot of policy recommendations in the book, but do you see any impediments to success that are sort of embedded in the business culture in Canada?
Well, I hope I won't get hunted out of the room on this. I've done a fair amount of research on, I did some research on resource policy a couple of years ago. Let's start with that. And I traveled around the world, not just in Canada. And one thing that came up quite a bit was that Canadians didn't have a very competitive mindset. You know, I think the phrase that people used was we were always competing for bronze, right? That we weren't sort of as hungry as the Americans were. And it came up again recently when I did a piece about innovation. I went down to Kitchener-Waterloo, and people were saying to me, most of the startups, their goal was just to get big enough until they could sell to an American company. Like, there was not this idea that you would see in the States of world domination. You know, I'm going to get big enough and I'm going to take over the world. No, there was a very limited ambition there. And I think these are anecdotal cases, although it came up again when I was talking to someone the other day about agri-food policy and how to grow the agri-food sector. And this guy who was a specialist in the sector was saying to me, well, we have this problem of companies just wanting to scale up to a certain part, and then they don't have a broader ambition beyond that. So I think that is an issue that has to be addressed. You know, is there something in the Canadian mindset? How do we get more hungry, more competitive? And one of the ways, obviously, is to remove whatever barriers there are to certain sectors. In the book, it was mentioned telecoms, transportation, banking. something that makes people fight a little harder, and then that might make them want to be a bit more competitive and get a little larger. So that was one thing. This is a soft issue on trade. It's not something that you can sort of measure in units and, you know, do nice charts with. But I think it's important in terms of the success. You can do all the things in the book, but if you don't have the businesses there that are willing to seize on those opportunities and get bigger, then we won't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that's changing? Like, you know, you have 2 young daughters. I have 2 young kids. And so we're always we're watching what children are preoccupied with in school, what they're seeing on television. You know, I'm interested, like this is a hypothesis, so I'm interested in hearing from people on an ongoing basis. Like, I think things, we're moving from, I would say, a branch plant economy where we were kind of price takers to how do we have more of a headquarters mentality? How do we say it's about, you know, both growing companies from Canada, the champions that we have, moving more of those high growth companies. So for example, in the Trade Commissioner Service, our challenge is to constantly refer people who are kind of at the beginning of their journey or looking for initial information to our digital services so they can spend time there, and to allocate as much of our time as possible to those high growth companies that are ready to take a really intentional step to, say, their 3rd or 4th, you know, export market. If you go and try the States, that should be relatively on the scale of things pretty easy. Same language, cheap flights, you know, understandable processes. What we want to be in the Trade Commissioner Service is really your partner in your first big risk, so that you feel that that's a little bit less risky. So go and talk to your trade commissioner. Use the CAN export program. You know, we will connect you to the various insurance products at EDC. We really want to spend our time on those companies with an intention to grow. You know, there wasn't kind of that Dragon's Den mentality. There wasn't that startup mentality. I'm really impressed with the incubator and accelerator community that we have across the country. I think, you know, the idea of, you know, going into university and then sort of, you know, you're getting your job for life and make sure it has a good pension, that's gone the way of the dodo. I think the generation that's coming up below me is certainly, like, they're willing to try and fail more quickly and be entrepreneurial. And I do feel that mindset is changing. I also have to say, we have to make more of our immigrant talent. We have to make more of new Canadians. So at the Trade Commissioner Service, we've pushed ourselves, for example, to say, are we reaching new immigrants, or are we kind of going after the same old groups? And we're trying to find out ways through, you know, and we're experimenting things, you know, through LinkedIn, through social media, through local diaspora groups. Are we meeting people that, through their own, you know, personal stories, have connections that they can add? And as one Chinese entrepreneur, she's Chinese. She's now moved to Canada. She is becoming like a China consultant. She said, I see so many businesses in Vancouver that could be exporting to China, and they have no idea. They don't know anything about China. They're nervous. And she goes, so it's my job to make them less nervous about going to China, and like giving them the skills and the know-how. The Asia Pacific Foundation working on its Asian acumen skills, particularly for India, for China, but even for markets like Indonesia. I know I put that out there because I'm really interested. Do you feel, with all of your work at IRPP, that the mindset is changing, or?
Well, I mean, I'm not the expert in the room, but I would just say that I hear a lot from companies that say, you took agri-food, and we have a agri-food policy series on right now in the magazine. But what I hear is that companies do want to expand, but they have problems scaling up. And that's because there's a lack of venture capital, and this is a whole other conversation. But I feel that from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of exciting innovation going on, but those younger entrepreneurs are having trouble at that level, and they're being, as Madelaine pointed out, they're being purchased before they're able to get big, and before they're able to become the big headquartered company in Canada.
I think the problem is more deep-seated maybe than you think, because these startups that were just, their ambition was just to grow big enough to make money, these were being set up by young Waterloo graduates down at Communitech. You know, so that is the next generation, and somehow they've caught the outlook of the older generation too. So I think, I don't know, completely what could be done there, but I think it's a problem that needs to be addressed.
So we're doing, and I think it's actually in the business community, a lot more what I would call sort of peer-to-peer mentoring of large-scale CEOs talking with growth CEOs. I think that's, don't take it shouldn't come from government. It has to come from the business community itself. And I think, we are seeing companies that when they want to find that pathway to venture capital, to growth capital, or to mentorship for growth, they're at least able to find like someone to talk to as opposed to kind of being out in the wilderness. So I feel that connectivity, as sort of ephemeral or maybe like new as that sounds, I think that's really important. What we want to counter is one American CEO who happily told me, I love Canada. It's where I acquire all of my companies. Speak the same language, it's just a flight up to Toronto. It's great. So, that's, we got to get a little, I'm with you, Madelaine, like we've got to get a little hungrier and get at that deep-seated, that sort of more deep-seated, like, kind of play to win attitude. But